വ്യവസ്ഥയെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം മുകളിൽ നിന്ന് വീഴുന്ന ഒന്നല്ല. ആ വ്യവസ്ഥയ്ക്കകത്ത് അന്തർലീനമായിട്ടുള്ള അതിൻ്റെ ഘടനയുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ടിട്ടുള്ള കാര്യമാണ് എന്നുള്ളത് അദ്ദേഹം സൂചിപ്പിച്ചു. ഇവയെല്ലാം തന്നെ ഒരു പ്രാകൃതമായ മൂലധന സ്വരൂപണ രീതിയെക്കുറിച്ച് അദ്ദേഹം ആവർത്തിക്കുകയുണ്ടായി. സമ്പത്തിൻ്റെ കേന്ദ്രീകരണം, ആ കേന്ദ്രീകരണം ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്ന അസമത്വം, വർദ്ധിക്കുന്ന വാല്യൂവിൽ ലാഭത്തിൻ്റെ അനുപാതം കൂടി വരികയും നമ്മുടെ ജനങ്ങളുടെ കൂലിയുടെ അനുപാതം കുറഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുകയും ചെയ്യുന്ന ഒരു സ്ഥിതി. അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ സമ്പത്ത് ഉത്പാദിപ്പിക്കപ്പെടുന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിലും അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു ചെറിയ ഭാഗം മാത്രമാണ് അധ്വാനിക്കുന്ന ജനങ്ങളിലേക്ക് എത്തുന്നത്. അതുണ്ടാക്കുന്ന പ്രതിസന്ധികൾ ഇന്ന് ഇന്ത്യൻ സമ്പദ് വ്യവസ്ഥയിൽ അതിന് ഓൾട്ടർനേറ്റീവായിട്ടുണ്ടാകുന്ന ബദലായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു രാഷ്ട്രീയ പ്രവർത്തനത്തിൻ്റെ ആ പ്രവർത്തനങ്ങളിലൂടെ രൂപപ്പെട്ടു വരേണ്ടുന്ന പ്രവർത്തന പരിപാടികളുടെ കാലഘട്ടം മറ്റും സൂചിപ്പിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടാകുന്ന ഒരു ലെഫ്റ്റ് ഓൾട്ടർനേറ്റീവിൻ്റെ ആവശ്യകത അതിലൂന്നിക്കൊണ്ടാണ് അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ പ്രവർത്തനം ഇവിടെ സമാപിച്ചത്. ഈ രണ്ട് പരസ്പര ബന്ധിതമായ പ്രബന്ധങ്ങളെ അടിസ്ഥാനപ്പെടുത്തി നമുക്കുള്ള സംശയങ്ങൾ അധികമായി വിശദീകരിക്കേണ്ടുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങളിലെല്ലാം എഴുതിത്തരാം. നമുക്ക് ഇപ്പോൾ ഭക്ഷണത്തിന് മുമ്പ് ഒരു 15 മിനിറ്റ് ഉപയോഗിക്കാം. അതിനുശേഷം 15 വിതരണം വന്നു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ അവതരണം കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ബാക്കി കിട്ടുന്ന സമയത്തിനനുസരിച്ചും ചർച്ച നിൽക്കാം. 3:30 മണി വരെയാണ് നമ്മുടെ സമയം. ഒരു 1:50 നമ്മൾ ഭക്ഷണത്തിന് തിരിയും. അതുവരെയുള്ള സമയം ചർച്ചയ്ക്ക് ഉപയോഗിക്കും.
With this last question, which is on Kerala's food security. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for these questions because I'm very grateful that very deep and interesting questions. Kerala is one of the states which implemented land reforms, but today we are facing a crisis in terms of food safety. What are the reasons for this? We also have a crisis in terms of less and less people not willing to work on land. Yes, absolutely correct. You know, in fact, but in Kerala, the reason why food production per capita has declined is because there has been a substantial shift of acreage from food to cash crops. For a very long time in Kerala, it was believed that this is very good because after all, we can grow cash crops. Cash crops we sell outside. We get foreign exchange, give it to the Reserve Bank of India, and in turn the central government would give us the food. But now you have a situation where there were periods, for instance, even in Kerala, earlier in some of the years, there were peasantry sites because the prices were not favorable and there was nobody protecting the peasants against price falls. And even more importantly, the central government, after it distinguished between APL, BPL, etc., stopped giving Kerala the kind of food support that was necessary for maintaining its universal public distribution system. At that point, the left democratic government, with which both C.P. Narayanan and I were associated, our government argued that we must prevent this shift towards cash crops and actually bring back in some sense food grain production. As you know, a law was passed against the diversion of paddy land for other purposes and a number of measures were adopted, the result of which was that at least in the last year of the government, acreage under food grain increased. I don't believe that given Kerala's pressure of population on land and given the kinds of land deals that we see now, Kerala may not become completely self-sufficient in food, but I think it can grow a very substantial proportion of its food requirements itself. Therefore, I think food security becomes an extremely important part in any planned strategy as far as Kerala is concerned. Land reforms, in fact, have given a certain advantage to Kerala, though land reforms in Kerala, in my view, are not complete because of the fact that the plantations are untouched by it. But at the same time, I think the real issue is to shift focus back to food grains production. I remember when we said this, many people said you are crazy. But as a matter of fact, I think that is the direction that Kerala should take. Okay, how do the government led by CPI propose to adopt a sincere stance against pro-liberalization policies when it has invariably become the main theme of central policy? Yes, I think, you see, it's a mistake to believe. It's a mistake to believe that the only way that a state can grow is by inviting big ticket projects and direct foreign investment to the state. If you believe that, then basically you're not believing anything different from Modi. I think it is possible, even under, nothing is as it were inevitable. I think even within a neoliberal regime, there can be, as it were, possibilities, degrees of freedom which can be utilized for some kind of an alternative. One thing which can be done, for instance, is for the state meaning the state government, to put purchasing power in the hands of the population at large that expands the domestic market. If it expands the domestic market, then you have the production of a large number of locally produced goods, which the multinationals don't have any comparative advantage in producing, in which case your local employment increases, that enlarges the market further. So the important thing is just to use whatever levers of government you have in your hands for improving the conditions of the people. I know that neoliberal policies put a constraint on that, but I think we have not pushed sufficiently. We have not reached the point where those constraints become so biting that we can't do anything further. So I think there is the possibility of an alternative strategy. Is there a need for us to raise a mass protest against UAPA? In my view, absolutely. What are the perceived... we after all opposed TADA, we opposed POTA, and I think it's very important to actually have an agitation against UAPA and also against AFSPA, because after all that is the one, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which now even Omar Abdullah is saying you remove from Kashmir. It's very important for us to raise this demand. Quite apart from the legal issue of withdrawal of UAPA, the left argument has always been that existing laws were good enough, you don't need this UAPA and so on. But quite apart from that, even when it is there, we have to also launch an agitation to ensure that there is time-bound clearing of cases through fast-track courts. No case should take more than a year. And of course, we must have a situation where the state pays compensation to those who have been victims of this. Compensation may be in the form of an assured government job to anybody who has been unlawfully detained under this act. So we have to think in terms of very many ways in which this can be done, but unfortunately, this has not received the kind of attention it should. I'll just give you one illustration. That in Australia, this gentleman from Bangalore, Dr. Hanif, was arrested. He was kept in jail for a maximum period in recent Australian history of 12 days. When Dr. Hanif was released from jail because he was proved innocent, not only did the Australian government tender an unconditional apology to him, but also gave him financial compensation of an amount that we don't exactly know. So Australian government can do this, but here, 8-9 years in jail, no compensation and no job at the end of it. It is shocking. What are the perceived reasons for the subsidy being paid directly to bank account? Is there a corporate agenda behind it? If yes, what is its impact on the economy? It has many dimensions. I would expect Professor Chandrasekhar also to say a little bit on this. But one of the very obvious things is that cash subsidy is in fact a reduction in subsidy. In an inflationary situation, you give a cash subsidy, and any such cash subsidy essentially means when prices are rising, then you have a 10% price rise, your cash subsidy's real value has gone down by 10%. Maybe you revise it later, but by the time you revised it, the subsidy itself has come down greatly. So to my mind, it's the thin end of the wedge, and it is really preparatory to a dismantling or a reduction, substantial scaling down of subsidies. What is the real economic position in Gujarat? Well, I think this is something which I would entreat you to look at this website which Professor Chandrasekhar and Professor Jayati Ghosh have called MacroScan. There is an article by Indira Hirve which actually looks at in detail all the human development indicators of Gujarat, and she is making a critique of Professor Jagdish Bhagwati of Columbia, who actually had lauded the Gujarat model of development. So please have a look at it. It's called www.macroscan.com. Okay. In my opinion, National Food Security Bill will be more an election gimmick than a law for addressing the problem of hunger in India. What's your comment? I completely agree. In fact, apparently they are going to have an ordinance today at 5 p.m. The very fact of having this ordinance rather than going through the parliament route when parliament should be meeting sometime in July could have been brought forward is basically to kind of score a point, as it were. So the idea is to score points rather than ensure that hunger is got rid of. Okay, the last question. Will the question quantitative easing of US lead to a currency war against the background the Chinese foreign exchange reserve value in terms of dollar has reduced? You always emphasize the need for a disconnect between drafting alternative policy left and however experience shows that other way comment is solicited. Will you elaborate on empiricism? Is there really a contradiction between imperialism and socialist countries now? Contradiction between imperialism and socialist countries, yes. Contradiction is the mode of existence of matter in society. You always have a contradiction. To what extent is that contradiction going to prevent imperialist machinations is a separate point. To my mind, if you look at Syria, for instance, it is the case that, for instance, the kind of American-Israeli plan for Syria is something which is being opposed by China and Russia and so on. You have, therefore, on specific situations, contradictions also playing themselves out in terms of policies. But on the other hand, I think it's also true that if you think in terms of the socialist country as a bulwark that prevents imperialism from hegemonizing the world, I think that would be too much to hope for. In my view, that is something which is not on the agenda at this moment, alas. Need for a disconnect from neoliberal policies. As I suggested earlier, I believe if you're talking about a state government, if LDF government comes to power tomorrow, I believe the LDF government can perform an agenda which can bring substantial benefits to the people. Now, of course, there is a point that this may hit against the neoliberal constraints, but even for that, it's very important for the you can keep the wages the same and you can raise the currency, or you can keep the value of currency the same and raise the wages. But if Germany actually increased wages even at the existing currency value, it would be some kind of a boost, at least as far as the EU is concerned, and certainly one of the ways of overcoming world imbalances. The fact that Germany does not do that is something which is indicative of the fact that there are all these currency conflicts across the different countries. I better stop there.
Well, there are basically three issues here. First is a set of questions relating to India's dependence on foreign finance. Is our country's current financial position fully dependent on foreign finance? And what are the effective ways to control the behavior of that finance without reducing investment? Let me put it this way. As I told you, neoliberalism in India, the trajectory which has been followed since 1991, let us say, or the 1980s, was actually a strategy which was adopted in response to a crisis. Now, by saying that, I don't mean it was adopted as a response to the balance of payments crisis of 1991. Of course, there was a balance of payments crisis in 1991, which made India go, pledge its gold and then go to the IMF and take an IMF loan. But the crisis was longer. So, crisis which Patnaik was speaking about, that we know that as opposed to the sort of promise which existed in the period between 1949 and about the middle of the 1960s, when there was an attempt to try and create what was an indigenous home market based strategy of capitalist development under Nehru and others, that because of certain prerequisites required for that, to break down the monopoly of land, to get rid of landlordism, to control the concentration of capital and of income and wealth in the urban areas and the corporate sector, etc., etc. you ended up with a situation where since the mid-1960s you had a crisis. It was a long crisis in which it was becoming difficult for capital to be able to, one, ensure the generation of a surplus, and two, in particular, to realize that surplus, to be able to sell its goods and actually convert commodities into profit money. But what we had really is that the way in which capital found a route out of that long crisis was, once things changed in the international system in the period of the 1970s with the oil surpluses, the accumulated pension funds in the developed industrial countries, etc., America's huge expenditures abroad in policing the world, in fighting the Vietnam War, and so on, we had this massive accumulation of liquidity in the international financial system. And what Indian capital, in collaboration of course with the state, basically did was to try and utilize access to that international liquidity as a way of trying to generate a new strategy which will allow it to overcome the crisis which it had been faced in the period from the mid-1960s up till 1980. So the whole strategy is based on a substantial increase in dependence on foreign finance. It was access to that finance which allowed you to move from a period between 1965 and 1980, when you had a secular stagnation in India, to a period from 1980 till 2008-9, in which you had different stages of the boom, the end of the Hindu rate of growth, and then a big boom, and so on and so forth. So dependence on foreign finance is huge, and that obviously affects the nature of the trajectory. And once it affects the nature of the trajectory, you cannot say, can I, pursuing this trajectory, try and control foreign investment in order to do what I want? What you can do is really choose to launch on a trajectory where you're not using dependence on foreign finance, which essentially consists in reshaping the trajectory. You cannot say that I'll allow foreign capital to come in large measure, particularly foreign financial capital to come in large measure, and then think of a strategy in which I can control this capital and achieve whatever goals I want to achieve, because what that capital will do is exit, because capital will never come in from abroad unless you guarantee the right to exit, which what foreign capital has. A linked issue is that, so what? Would this lead to a debt crisis? Well, let me put it this way. For a long period of time after, we had a debt crisis in 1991 because all of the capital which came in between 1981 and 1991 was in the form largely of debt, of external commercial borrowing. The external debt to GDP ratio of India doubled between 1980 and 1990 before the crisis came. But for a significant period after that, a large part of the foreign capital inflow into India was not debt. It came in the form of foreign portfolio investment, it came in the form of foreign direct investment, it came in the form of private placement capital, which is firms going in for private placement and so on of their equity. NDTV, for example, sold a lot of its shares without having to go to the market in the first place. So you actually had non-debt capital inflows of significant measure because bankers, having burnt their fingers in 1991, didn't want to come in immediately. But it is true that if you take the most recent period, the period after about 2004-5, the share of debt in total capital inflow has been going up considerably, and this has created the possibility of a debt crisis just as much as the other kind of capital creates the possibility that there can be an outflow of capital which generates a crisis, a currency crisis, a balance of payments crisis. What we also need to do is to take account of the fact that if there is indeed an increasing dependence on debt, and despite that inflow, there is a significant depreciation of the rupee, which has, as you know, gone from 39 to 58. If there is a significant depreciation of the rupee, those who borrowed foreign capital in order to make rupee expenditures now will find that they need more and more rupees to get each dollar in order to meet their interest and in order to meet their amortization. That is, the rupee burden of foreign debt goes up massively if you have a depreciation of the currency. And given the recent depreciation, therefore, in recent times, the last 2-3 years, there is in fact an added danger of a debt crisis. Not merely a debt crisis which comes because you don't have enough foreign exchange, but a debt crisis which comes because the rupee burden is so much that firms which have taken on this debt can actually collapse, particularly if there's a slowdown in growth. Last question in this area, foreign capital is coming from outside. What does it take back? it takes back surplus. It takes back surplus either straight away in the form of a return, and now since 2003-4, if a foreign investor comes into India's stock market, invests one day, sells that investment after 365 days, on the 366th day, let us say, and makes